Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill, Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Jesse Prinz, who is Professor of Philosophy at the City University of New York. He works primarily in the philosophy of psychology and ethics, and has authored several books and articles addressing such topics as emotion, moral psychology, aesthetics, and consciousness. Welcome, Jesse.
Wonderful to be here with you. As you know, I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Thanks so much. And thanks for doing this on a holiday. And I want to start with one of your articles, Biology, Culture, and Emotion. You're looking at sort of the variation in emotions, or maybe the recognition of emotions across cultures. So before we get into the details of this, is there a sort of a crisp definition for emotion? What do we mean by emotion?
Well, that is one of the most contested questions in the area, but there is a fair amount of convergence on the kinds of things that typically arise in an emotion episode. So most people studying the emotions will say emotions characteristically involve some kind of appraisal of the situation you're in, where you're recognizing that some event, typically, though not always an event outside of the self, has some bearing on your well-being.
Yeah.
And in light of the specific kind of bearing, is it a threat? Is it an offense? Is it the satisfaction of a goal? You have a response, characteristically a physiological response, but it can also involve a response in your style of thinking or reasoning or understanding or perceiving.
Yeah.
And then you have an experience of that change. So if your body is preparing for a flight away from this potential threat, for instance, you'll have an experience of that bodily preparation. So the complete cascade of these events, the appraisal, the physiological change, the change in thinking style, and the experience thereof give rise to what's characteristically thought of as an emotion.
Okay. And so to abstract a little bit, so given data and context, most humans have a response to that. Do other observers understand that fairly universally, or there's a lot of noise in that response?
There was a view, I think in many ways it remains the orthodoxy, though its position of uncontested authority has been weakened in recent years. There was a view that is universalist in its orientation. So Charles Darwin wrote a book on the recognition of emotion in man and animals, and his view was that most of our emotions are based in our biology. They're shared by non-human animals, and their expressions are recognizable universally. And this gave rise to a cottage industry of research on cross-cultural emotion recognition. Darwin himself was the first to collect data on the recognition of emotions in cultures that were removed from Western Europe. And that continued into the early part of the 20th century at a trickle. But in the 1960s, late 1960s, a group of researchers who were trained by a prominent emotion psychologist named Sylvan Tompkins set out to confirm Darwin's hypothesis. And the most famous of them, Paul Ekman, collected data in the highlands of Papua New Guinea among a group of people called the Foray. And he reported that 6 emotions, the 6 he studied, were recognized in precisely the same way by people who were at a far distant cultural remove from the Anglophone West. That view became the textbook view. And the thought that emotions can be recognized across context, across culture, across language, would have been a fact of science, presented as an uncontested fact of science, until fairly recently, when reanalysis of some of that work and a growing body of counterclaims has begun to reopen those debates. And I myself happen to fall on the opposing side, thinking that Darwin's universalism was probably significantly overstated.
And so it's sort of a debate between hardware and software in some sense, right? So if it is biology driven, these 6 sort of basic emotions, if it is biology driven, if it's hardware driven, the chance of that being universal is a lot higher. But if it's not, then it's unlikely to be true, right?
In a way, I would say the hardware-software distinction tends to get us into trouble with nature-nurture debates because people feel they need to pick sides, when in truth, the position that tends to be right is a combination of the two. Sometimes people in artificial intelligence talk about the human brain as having wetware, which is both literally true, but also a kind of clever metaphor for capturing the idea that the physical apparatus through which we think and feel is highly plastic. So we have a bit of hardware like a computer would have, but unlike the wiring in your computer, our brains rewire with experience. So what we get from that picture is a story according to which it's not that emotions are all cultural, nor is it that they're all biological. It's that from the earliest hours of life, these biological foundations are getting retuned and reshaped through socialization. So we have commonalities and we have emotions that have some degree of recognizability across contexts, but they also are subject to considerable social forces.
Yeah, so I would imagine the expression of emotions and the recognition of it would have had some survival benefits early, right?
It's hard to speculate, of course, about the evolutionary paths. In this particular case, I would say a further limitation is emotion recognition is a skill we know to be fairly developed in humans, but it's less clear how good other animals are at emotion recognition. So assumptions about its contribution to survival are quite conjectural. We don't have, beyond the exceptional case of things like alarm calls, which are quite kind of stereotyped in some non-human animals, we don't have evidence that fine-tuned emotion recognition is a key to survival. But there's no doubt that in contemporary life, emotion recognition is valuable, contributes to our success and our fluid engagement in the social world. So there's every reason to think that that's been true for us from the beginning.
Yeah. Without a survival benefit, what would have been the reasons for its? I'm just talking about humans here. But what would have been the reasons for an expression of emotions?
Darwin himself didn't think that most expressions were adaptive. He thought some of them just came accidentally from the overflowing of energies in the organism. So He thought there were certain expressions like baring your teeth in anger that were holdovers from uh, other mammals who had large canines who could expose a potential weapon by baring their teeth. There's a view that the goosebumps we get when afraid come from being descended from ancestors whose bodies were covered with hair. And if you grew your physical appearance by having your hair follicles stand on end, you might be a less tempting object of predation by a would-be aggressor. So there are some of these that are adaptive, but he himself thought many of them were not. And I do think, emotion recognition for us in social contexts sometimes may connect to recognition of a possibility of action. So if somebody raises their fists, clenches their fists in a way that implies aggression, that's a direct signal that an action will take place. And there are authors, maybe most famously in recent literature, a psychologist named Alan Friedland, who claims that all emotion expressions are not conveying inner feelings, but rather the promise or potentiality of action. But I myself think it's quite a stretch. If you think, for example, of some of our most recognizable expressions, like the tears we shed in sorrow, it's not clear that that's suggestive of any action we're about to perform. Maybe it can be thought of as a supplication, a way of expressing our neediness and asking for assistance. So it has a potential communicative function, and recognizing it might be of some value. But I think the idea that we recognize emotions need not be integral to the origins of these emotions in any evolutionary sense.
Yeah, the tears are quite interesting. I don't know. Was there anything like sort of very? I remember something like the tears really originated much later in human progression, perhaps even post agriculture. Is that true, or do we have any data?
I think we don't have to, I mean, it would be difficult to, in general, say anything about human emotion in an evolutionary sense by basis of physical evidence. So the archaeological record prior to language would be somewhat ambiguous on this. Tears are unusual in that it's said that we are the only animal that tears in sorrow or tears as an emotional expression. There's some work suggesting the chemistry of tears differs when we cry from sorrow as opposed to crying from an irritant in the air, which suggests their fairly late development. But there's no doubt that the function of tears does seem to be quite social in nature and quite varied across social contexts. So for instance, we have platitudes like boys don't cry, but if you look, for example, at the biblical references to crying, not only do men cry, but kings and prophets cry. It's considered an expression of moral regard, and also an important way of expressing a sense of loss or mourning, to weep openly. And indeed, the displays of despair and grief are in many countries still quite ritualized. So if you look, for example, at countries where there are professional mourners who come to a funeral in order to wail quite vocally, they've turned what might be thought of as a purely natural or instinctive expression into a kind of performance. And far from thinking of that as anomalous, I actually think that in a way, all of our emotions have a kind of performativity. And even when we take ourselves to be acting instinctively from our biological nature, those performances, those ways of expressing our emotion are culturally tuned. So whether or not crying as a actual physiological response dates to the Neolithic or earlier, there's no doubt that the way it's done and the meanings it has are products of our continuing cultural development.
Mm. You described a lot of very interesting field studies in the paper, Jesse. And if I remember correctly, one of them is if you take blank faces and you put them in a context, then the observer appears to be able to fill in the context to that face and then recognize that as some emotion or something along those lines.
Yeah, there's a long, interesting history of this idea, which includes contact with early cinema. So, a very pioneering Soviet filmmaker, Kuleshov, when editing was first being developed as a technology for the production of film, he speculated that a neutral face, a face that decontextualized would have no emotional meaning whatsoever, could be perceived as everything as varied as from lust to grief to hunger, depending on it, whether it was paired with a casket in the case of grief, an attractive person in the case of lust, or a beautiful meal in the case of hunger. So he would edit film to pair this face with these different precursor objects and argue that this changed the meaning. There has been empirical work in recent years that's consistent with that finding. The effects are subtle, but there's no doubt that a face, even showing a fairly strong emotion, can be perceived in radically different ways. Sometimes the psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett illustrates this by showing a photograph of the face of Serena Williams just after winning a tennis tournament. And it's such an extreme expression of an emotion that if you didn't know the context, you could equally see it as rage or despair, when in fact it's probably euphoria.
Yeah, I would guess that recognition of emotion is probably computationally costly for the brain. Facial recognition is at least initially would have been computationally expensive, and so the brain would have created heuristics to sort of reduce that cost in some sense. So, is it possible that from a societal perspective, our ability to really understand emotions is declining? Do we have any data on that?
It's a good question. I obviously our abilities to recognize emotion are greatly enhanced by the fact that visual culture has become such a consuming part of our life. So in
Yeah.
some ways we're at a significant advantage. Though I think in a way vision gives us so much information that the typical laboratory study where you're presented with a still face in a very stereotyped configuration is probably not that consistent with the normal context of emotion recognition. In a film setting, for instance, we have a lot of narrative content, we have verbal cues, we have not just the face, but the posture. The face is dynamic, it changes over time. And the vast majority of emotions that people experience are not pure. We tend, except in cases of extremity, not to have just grief or just anger or just disgust. We have amalgams of those, and even just taking those three, the typical stimulus that would make us feel intense grief, say a great political injustice that involves harm, would also make us feel disgust at the offenders and despair at the loss. So I think the likelihood is that visual culture has played a role in simultaneously increasing our sensitivity to various modes of expression, but also probably confronting us with such nuance that our laboratory experiments would kind of misrepresent the ways in which actual emotion recognition works in the wild.
Yeah. You're also looking at sort of the cultural influence on emotions and the recognition of it. And as you say, the visual culture we have now, social media like Facebook with 1.5 billion people on it or something along those lines. Do you think we are sort of standardizing emotions across the world? That variation is declining?
I think there is certainly reason to think that the recognition of facial emotions is very subject to aspects of social identity in ways that would suggest a lack of universalization, and that's impacting both the perceiver side and the emoter side. So, for instance, there's a lot of ways in which emotion is gendered and raced and cultured, and also subjected to various cultural biases and values. So, women are discouraged from experiencing anger. People of color are perceived as being more angry than they actually are. There's research on what's called the resting bitch face, where, if you'll excuse the expression, where women showing a neutral face are perceived as more angry than they are. So, given these kinds of norms, and also given just cultural differences in what are considered appropriate expressions and appropriate context for expression, we end up with enough variation both in the biases we bring to this as perceivers and in the actual dispositions we have as emoters to flatten things out. I think given that variation, the likelihood of shared visual culture in no way guarantees greater universality. In fact, it might just deeply or more deeply entrench some of these variations.
That's really interesting. So, how people express and recognize emotions are driven by the cultural context, the cultural aspects that they grew up in. And you describe a lot of experiments around this too, right? So, there is distinct differences between Eastern and Western cultures. Have there been any experiment to, somebody who's sort of grown up in the Eastern culture and then transferred to the Western culture? And how long does it take for that person to sort of redesign or re-engineer the brain to do things differently?
Some people posit what's called a cultural critical period, and the thought is if you acculturate, if you move to a new cultural setting early enough, which usually means middle childhood, so that you spend your adolescence, the years leading up to your adolescence, through your adolescence in the new culture, there will be a high degree of assimilation. Unlike language, where it needs to be pre-adolescent, a lot of cultural development for us happens in teenage years. And that itself might be a cultural product. There are claims that the whole notion of teenage life as a distinctive period in human biography is a fairly recent invention. But as a result of that invention, we are expected during our teenage years to settle in on a bunch of our tastes and interests and our social patterns. It's a time where we come of age with respect to our social independence. We form groups of peers who become major sources of influence that exceed the influence of our biological or rearing families. And it's really at that time where things like musical taste get set down. So all of us as 40 and 50-year-olds still enjoy the tunes we were listening to as teenagers. Likewise, some of our emotional dispositions may be set down more firmly in that time. I myself think the notion of a critical period, even for language, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. It might be a kind of graded idea where we're more likely to settle into certain patterns at certain periods of our life. But I do think those can evolve and change over the lifespan as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have one symptom, which is accents, which is, there's a lot of data around accents when you shift to another language. There was a hypothesis that after that critical period, every time you express something, the brain has to make a translation, and there is a slight delay in that translation that shows up as accent in the individual speaking. I don't know what the latest thinking is on that, but it is sort of related to emotions too, right? It will be interesting to see if the brain is doing some sort of a translation to fit in.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I definitely think the case of accent is instructive insofar as it's not fixed. Like if you think about an actor who maybe has taken on a part well into adulthood, where they have to say have a South African accent and they're reared in Brooklyn, they might do it imperfectly. They'll certainly do it effortfully. but they might be competent, and depending on how much energy they put into it, they could pull it off. And one can, if one has an accent, well into adulthood, improve on that in various ways by developing skills. But it will be more effortful. And I think that kind of fluency with emotions may be similar. So somebody who immigrates late, I mean, all of my grandparents were refugees and came to the United States in adulthood, and came in part because of a despairing relationship with their parent countries, came to really view themselves as American, and tried very, very hard to exist here and assimilated to different degrees. And I do think came to be quite American in style in various respects. So Americans tend to be very confessional. They tend to be loud and expressive as compared to some other countries that are more reserved. They're more hedonistic, more pleasure-seeking.
Mm.
And I do think some of those emotional patterns, emotional habits are learnable. It's a jarring process, and maybe one that the immigrant will resist because their own sense of identity is threatened by that kind of transformation.
Yeah.
But I think many find it possible in adulthood to adapt.
Yeah. I want to go into one of your books, Culture, Psychiatry, and Ontology. You say those who delve into cross-cultural research in psychiatry are often struck by descriptions of mental disorders found across the globe. And these are striking in both their range and unfamiliarity, you say. So you talk about sort of culture-bound syndromes, something that I had no clue about, Jesse. But it appears that different cultures have sort of different diseases and different symptoms, perhaps different diagnostic processes. So what exactly are we finding there?
The term was introduced to capture something that people doing psychiatric work outside of their home culture were finding, which is that sometimes there are conditions, often with names, that are actually quite common and widely discussed and recognizable and understood by local population, for which there is no clear analog back home. An example of this, there are a number of what are called hyper-startled disorders. The most widely discussed in the West is one called Lata, which is found in Southeast Asia, where a person will enter into a trance-like state. And in that state, they'll show a series of quite striking symptoms. One of them, from which the term hyper-startle comes, is a very, very sensitive startle response. So a sound that wouldn't cause a startle reaction in us might cause a fairly pronounced startle reaction in somebody in this state. But other symptoms include echolalia, where people repeat words that are said to them, and even things like shouting or using obscenities or language that's deemed inappropriate in ordinary social contexts. And the person who's undergone this state transformation will eventually emerge from it, and on emerging will sometimes be amnestic for the episode, meaning they won't recall having been through this episode. So to see someone go into a trance where their behavior becomes quite unusual is for us a jarring experience. From a clinician's perspective, there's no doubt that such a state is more than a mere piece of performance in a conscious way. It's not an act, it's not theater. It's physiological. There are ways in which these states relate to states that we can describe in physiological terms, like the state you might go into when you're hyperventilating. But on the other hand, we don't find this particular syndrome here at home. So it's a disorder. It's associated with mental stress or strife. It's viewed in a medicalized or equivalent way as a kind of adverse condition, and it's subject to local practices of treatment. So the term culture bound was introduced to refer to such states, but of course it raised the question about our own taxonomies of mental disorder or mental illness at home. Are conditions that we think of as commonplace, as being rooted in biological abnormalities. We use phrases like chemical imbalance, and here I'm thinking of things like depression or anxiety, even schizophrenia, ADHD, obsessive compulsive, all those conditions that populate our medical textbooks in psychiatry. Maybe those are culture bound as well.
What is sort of the deeper explanation for it? At least on the surface, one would say, we got 8.4 billion clones around the world. There's systems, there is no real difference in their genes. So from a biological perspective, we have near clones in different cultures. Why are we finding certain syndromes in certain cultures? What would be sort of the deeper explanation for it?
Well, in one way, you can think about mental illness functionally. That is to say, you can think about mental illness as a way of coping, coping with trauma, coping with stress, coping with disability, various limitations that are placed on human life. And so construed, you can see immediately that there are many, many different ways to cope. But there might be certain patterns of coping that, though flexible and showing a fair degree of variation, are particularly suitable for specific contexts. And those are going to be extremely sensitive to cultural variables. So for instance, there's some evidence that in the West, women are somewhat more likely than men to have mental disorders that are characterized as internalizing. That is, they take stressors and pain and turn it inward on themselves, whereas men tend to be slightly more likely than women to have externalizing symptoms, where they lash out at others. So something like psychopathy, which involves antisocial behavior, is diagnosed more frequently in men. And something like depression, where you turn inward and withdraw from society, is somewhat more likely in women. And if you consider a kind of patriarchal context where men do have more traffic with the world and are given more latitude for their anger and for behavior that is antisocial, the idea that stressors lead to lashing out. Men are the ones committing these mass shootings. Men are the ones who go postal, to use that phrase, because male frustrations and disappointments in life are given license to express in ways that harm others, whereas women are more socialized to engage in self-harm. So I think in a way you can think about the human, universal human suite of options, which is quite wide-ranging, but has commonalities. And from this menu, cultural conditions will determine which items in this suite are more likely to occur.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's a mental disorder conditioned by culture in some sense, right? So the analog, I think, in some sense, would be epigenetics. So it's not just your genes, but what you ate and where you lived and what your gut bacteria look like that ultimately results in diseases. It's sort of in a similar thing, but it's really it's not at the system level, but more from a culture perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think you mentioned the microbiome, all of those aspects of our environment outside of our genes, including things like diet, even as we know from seasonal affective disorder, even the climate zone we live in and the amount of light we get, all those things are factors as well. So I think broadly holistic views of mental health that take each of these things into consideration are the most promising. I do think there's a strong tendency, though, even in those particular moves, to the epigenetic, the microbiomic, to continue to privilege biology in our thinking about mental health. and to some detriment. Obviously, people with mental disorders do continue to seek psychotherapy and various interventions that are treated at the level of the person, at the level of your life conditions and experience. But this tendency to move to biology is part of a broader trend in, I think, contemporary society to want to think about these things in very mechanistic terms. And when we do that, it's a little bit like, the concept of soma, where you give people a medical intervention that's designed to treat the symptom, where you think that the disorder is a kind of imbalance in the brain, a metaphor that has no meaning, by the way. There's no, balance of chemistry that we've ever measured or have a tool for measuring. But the idea that this is some chemical imbalance that we can correct pharmaceutically is problematic, not because pharmaceuticals shouldn't be used to bring people relief and help them cope, but because it mislocates the problem in biology, when very often it's life conditions and trauma and biography, it's cultural biases that are at work as well. In the philosophy of disability and activism around disability, there's been a tendency to characterize disability not as a problem with the person, but as a problem of fit. So, for example, Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's a disability theorist, uses the term misfit to refer to people with disabilities because it captures the way in which the limitations on somebody's achievements in the world are often imposed by the external environment. And the world is better suited for some kinds of bodies and some kinds of minds than for others. And if we think of the patient as a person with an internal problem that needs to be treated, as opposed to a human being located in a social setting, we'll sometimes make our interventions too restricted and miss out on the opportunity to improve the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even if we look at it mechanistically, Jesse, there is still, we have to, at the very least, understand that culture has a significant effect on your brain, on your body. And so you have conditions that have substantially changed the system, and how it responds to something is going to be quite different from culture to culture. So we have to at least, we can still go to the reductionist approach, if we like. But even there, you're missing a major attribute that affects what you're trying to treat.
Absolutely. In some ways, the biological tendency is quite surprising because I think it's manifest in an extreme way that human beings are shaped by culture. We need only open our eyes. So when I look around me, I'm first of all, I'm clothed. I'm in a structure, a home that was built from multiple materials, wood carved from out of trees and bricks and glass. And I'm surrounded by books that are created from paper and printed using pigments that are created in laboratories, on bookshelves made of composite particle board. We're surrounded by things that we built. And once we realize that human beings have this distinctive capacity to modify their physical environment so profoundly, and to see that those modifications are not universal from place to place, but have changed over historical time, there's every reason to think that we are exerting similar influence on our minds. And if we grant that we need to have biological minds of a certain kind to do this, and therefore there is a biological story to what makes us human, we should also respect that that biological story is one that fundamentally involves this kind of plasticity.
Right. We'll take a quick break, Jesse. When we come back, we'll talk about the book that you're working on, Social Construction.
Wonderful.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back, Jesse. We were talking about how culture has an important effect on how people express emotions, how they recognize them, but also on diseases, mental diseases, especially disorders, I should say, how the symptoms of diseases and certain diseases are only found in certain cultures. So culture appears to have a strong influence on many of these things. You're working on a book, Social Construction, in which you say the culture wars have pit humanistic against scientists, with the former arguing that categories are social instructs and that truth is relative to conceptual frameworks. So social constructionists are depicted as science critics, you say, and perhaps even harbingers of the post-truth age. But you don't think so. You think science is committed to constructionism in some form. Um, so before we get the details of this, what exactly do you mean by constructionism?
Well, it's a metaphor, of course, but the basic idea behind social constructionism is that the basic things that we take to populate our world, the categories that we use to identify things, to describe things, to divide things, are not joints in nature. They're not the categories that would exist if we as observers weren't here to divide things up. That whenever we introduce a word to characterize some aspect of reality, we're in sense making a choice. We could have divided differently. And
Yeah.
those choices are not simply passive. We're not simply, dividing the pie and letting it sit. The division itself can have an impact. So this is most pronounced in the social world, where human classification can impact human lives in quite profound ways. But even in the natural sciences, there are ways in which our systems of classification play a role in organizing, arranging, and impacting reality.
So, so why do you think so? So you say science is committed to constructionism, and you don't really see, sort of a difference between what science is doing and what social sciences might be doing. Um, but in science, it at least feels more absolute. Um, you don't buy that.
Well, I think science is not interested in absolutes. Science is interested in giving us some understanding and, in some domains, some ability to control a very messy world.
Yeah.
And scientists know that one way of doing so will be idealization, will be simplification, will be creating stories that are easy to learn, easy to transmit, and that requires a fairly reductive explanatory project, coming up with generalizations and laws that have some robustness. But there's a recognition from the starting gate that the world itself is quite disorganized, quite messy, quite complicated, quite sensitive to variation across contexts. So I
Yeah.
think scientific practice, far from being opposed to these construction ideas, um, in some ways is self-aware as that its fundamental role is a kind of construction.
Mhm.
Why do science? What is science? And one answer is science is a way to make all this messiness more intelligible to ourselves.
Yeah. And as you said, the classification itself has an effect on classification. So it's sort of a thing that influences itself. So the end outcome depends a lot on the initial conditions.
Yes, that's certainly right, and it depends on factors that are quite hard to predict in advance. So if you kind of walk through the sciences and different cases in each, many things can make a difference. So in physics, you might say, okay, well, of course, planets aren't constructed. These are these big celestial bodies that exist out there in the solar system and have been around, many of them, for millions of years before we have. Um, the bodies exist, that's true. But once you start to label them, and for instance, call something a star, call something a planet, you are putting it in a group, and it is in that gesture that you're doing some kind of construction. And why? So why do we want to talk about, say, the planets in our solar system? Well, they're interesting objects to study, but in choosing to study them, we've had to decide which things belong to that particular classification. And the term planet, which once was defined in a way that included 9 celestial bodies in our solar system, was recently redefined to exclude one of those 9, Pluto.
Right.
And Pluto was demoted to what's now called a dwarf planet, where the term planet was redefined to have a new condition intentionally designed to exclude Pluto. In particular, planets were restricted to celestial bodies that clear their neighborhoods, a metaphor basically capturing the idea that the pathway through which a planet travels is not interrupted by something of greater gravitational force. Now, why do they do this? The answer is simple. At the time they did this, they had discovered at more distant locations within our solar system about 200 other celestial bodies that met the then current classification of planets. And they literally were worried that school children would now have to memorize 209 celestial bodies rather than what had been a very tractable list.
Yeah.
The definitions are also used in other ways that seem arbitrary. So for instance, asteroids are defined as minor planets, but some of them also qualify as dwarf planets. And the reason why they're not planets is just because their size is below a certain threshold and their shape is more imperfect. Now, these are very graded in relative terms. What's the size that makes something a planet? That's an arbitrary cutoff. How round does something have to be a planet? That's an arbitrary cutoff. And at the same time, we co-classify things that are extremely different. So if you take gaseous planets and icy planets and rocky planets, these are very, very different kinds of celestial bodies with different properties. And the planets themselves vary enormously in size, again, creating different behaviors, but we co-classify them as planets. So it's just a reminder that there are many, many different ways to carve up nature. And there isn't a given way to do it, even in something as physical and real and mind independent as celestial bodies. The way we choose is usually beholden to a variety of interests. Some of those are scientific, and some of them are as simple as giving our school kids an easy time with their memorization tasks.
Yeah, so it's a matter of convenience. I was thinking, Jesse, as you were talking, if you take an Amazon tribe or something like that who haven't had any contact with the modern humans, and we look at something that is in common, maybe some categories of nature or something like that, it'd be interesting to see where they ended up in this categorization. Do we see any commonality, or do we see totally orthogonal categories?
There is some work on this. I mean, basic question is, are taxonomies, say, of the natural world hierarchical? That is, so we have in, say, non-human animals, we can talk about a breed and then a species, and then a broader category like animal above that, living thing above that. So we get these kind of nested hierarchies. And one might wonder, does every group organize things in this kind of way? And there is some variation. I mean, one can organize categories somewhat differently. So for instance, one can classify things that interact with each other. So if you think about a kind of ecosystem where there are different living things that coexist, maybe some insects and some mammals and some plant forms that share certain behavioral routines that engage one another, or ways of being in the world that engage one another, that might be thought of as a category as well. So instead of having the overarching category mammal, you might have the overarching category forest dweller or sea dweller. And there your taxonomies might begin to look different from the ones we have.
Yeah. So what you're saying here is that it's a matter of convenience. There's nothing absolute about it. And where you end up is probably a function of where you started and how you started. But then you talk about the sort of social construction and social categories: gender, race, disability, mental illness. All these things have, as you mentioned, significant policy implications too. And so if you look across cultures, do we see differences in these things?
Well, absolutely. I think this, the physical sciences, the hard sciences are instructive in a way, because I do think they're the limit case. They're the case where we really think nature has joints. And when we start to discover, for example, that the periodic table of the elements is full of arbitrary idealizations, like
Yeah.
the exclusion of isotopes, even when those isotopes are the more common form of the element in nature, or the inclusion of dozens of elements that don't actually exist in nature and have to be created in a laboratory.
Yeah.
Or we look in biology and see the arbitrariness of excluding viruses from the definition of life, or the ways in which a single field might, depending on current explanatory goals, define gene differently or define species differently. Those are surprising cases. But when we turn to things like gender and race, there's I think a bigger recognition of the way in which social forces may play a role there. And of course, for the purposes of human life, those are classifications that make a bigger difference. One might think it's obvious that these social categories are socially constructed. So, for example, while it was once widely believed that aspects of gender difference in behavior had a biological basis, we now readily recognize that many aspects of gender difference in behavior, like wardrobe differences or some differences of taste, have a cultural origin. But the question is, how far does that go? And I think even today in the social realm, where cultural social forces should be our default mode of explanation, there's a continuing tendency to biologically construe various aspects of human identity. This includes sex and gender, it includes sexuality, and it includes race, among others. And for each of these, there are very active research programs trying to identify biological correlates, but there are equally active efforts to show that some aspects of each of these human classifications is cultural in nature.
Have there been, I'm thinking specifically about social categories, have there been any situation in the past where we recognized it's really messy, let's start over, let's go back and recategorize? Has there been any such situation in the past in history?
Well, we in some ways this is always the history, because these classifications change. And so, for example, if you look into the history of racial classification, the format that we get was a fairly modern invention, Enlightenment invention, where there was an initial move. People like François Bernier tried to divide the world into people who are basically began thinking of white, red, yellow, and black, African origin, European origin, Asian origin, especially there, East Asian origin, and from the Americas, indigenous to the Americas. Those are not classifications that had existed before, and they have in many ways changed over historical time. And even now we're seeing a fair amount of plasticity. So in racial classification, we have recognitions that vary cross-culturally. If you go say to the African continent, even in sub-Saharan African, there's a lot of racial demarcations that we wouldn't recognize among African Americans. If you go to the subcontinent, you'll get different classifications. Say someone from Sri Lanka or from the north of the subcontinent who might have more Central Asian ancestry, you'll get different racial classifications. In South America, in a place like Brazil, but also historically, you get much finer grained classifications of black and brown people. In the Caribbean, somebody who might be classified as black in North America might be considered a white person in the Caribbean. So a tremendous amount of variation, and these things will get negotiated, altered, and changed over time. Even with gender, if you consider the growing visibility of not just intersex and transgender people, but also non-binary people, the availability of categories that may have applied accurately to people throughout historical time, the availability of those categories gives people a little bit more freedom and recognition in how they end up organizing and constructing their lives. So there's right now a very sort of contested debate about whether, say, man and woman should be defined in biological terms, and those who reject those definitions, myself among them, think that, first of all, these concepts have always been multi-pronged and multifaceted, and there are many aspects to sex and gender that transcend biology. There's also no uniformity or consistency at the level of biological classification. There are many, many different biological schemes. But also, and perhaps most importantly, in light of your question, categories are not things that get fixed in time. They are things we can shift and alter. So if the demands of social justice, for instance, are best served by more expansive notions of gender, then that's a perfectly good reason to enrich those vocabularies. So, for instance, in Indian context, where you have the hijras, or in Mexico, where you have the mujeres, there are recognized third genders, and those change their construal over time. So the term transgender is now being used increasingly in India. They changed their legal standing and their official recognition. So now in India, you can officially be recognized by the state as not being male or female. And in many parts of Western Europe and the US, in some states, being able to select your gender based on your identity rather than your birth assignment, and in certain places being able to select a non-binary gender, have become legal realities and increasingly cultural realities as well.
Yeah, it's sort of curious, Jesse, that the scientific process of categorization. Take a measurement of a property, to put that into a bucket. We don't do that in social categorization. We appear to use sort of visible surface features that often has no correlation to if you were to go measure race, for example, of 8.4 billion people, it is almost meaningless, right? And so why are these categorization processes so different?
Of course, it's going to depend a little bit on one's position on some of these debates, because there are people who think they oughtn't be different, that really things are real only if they're real independent of our systems of classification. They're real only if they're not constructed. And then using the physical sciences as a model, they'll therefore assume that the reality of race or of sexuality or of gender requires finding something that's hidden from view. So, for instance, there's an enormous research into genetic correlates of race. There's an enormous research program into the genetic correlates of sexuality. And those research programs are very, very well funded, and they speak to this desire to find something in the hidden microstructure of the world to give it legitimacy. And the findings tend to be quite unimpressive. So, for example, in the case of homosexuality, and this is just using fairly culturally homogeneous samples in the US and Great Britain, you can find maybe 8% of the variance in homosexuality is associated with genes, but not with any one gene, with many, many genes. And the best performing genes account for about 0.4% of the variance. And those same genes are also associated with variance in traits that have nothing to do with sexuality, like smoking or risk-taking or openness to experience. And that's within a homogeneous sample. So you keep things culturally fixed, and that greatly inflates genetic contribution. Trivially, if you take everyone who has the same nurture, any difference that remains between them will be nature. If you think about looking for, say, gay genes across a broader cultural range, the likelihood of a genetic contribution would drop off from 8% variance to probably near zero. Now, 8% of variance means that the lion's share, I mean, by a very large margin, of variation in sexual fantasy and behavior is not genetic. And very similar story can be told about race. The concept of race in the human species is biologically meaningless. And there are many subgroups, say, in the sub-Saharan African continent that are farther from each other than many Africans are from Europeans. So race turns out to lack anything at the biological level that maps onto our folk categories. So I think while many of us are thinking about social kinds as on the surface, as something grounded in human interests and human classification, others are still holding out hope that there is some underlying hidden biological reality.
So in some sense, what you're saying is that the measurement is not possible. There is really no, it becomes sort of meaningless from a scientific perspective. And so we are, in some sense, back to square one. So this is a political decision, really, in some ways, right? And so the political decision then leads to policies, and the policies have differing effects on these classification schemes. And so we can attempt to incrementally change them. But are we getting to a situation that we need to really look at it more systematically, wipe the slate clean and start over?
I think the danger with wiping the slate clean is it itself, in the interest of justice, can turn into an injustice. So, for example, in thinking about race, there have been many people who have wanted to eliminate the category of our racial categories. And some of those people have just been political liberals who think that if we can behave in ways that are colorblind, we'll end up with a more just society. And the critique of that has simply been that colorblindness itself becomes a kind of racism, because if you already have structures in place that disadvantage people, then trying to, say, make hiring decisions or admissions decisions or mortgage loan decisions in a way that doesn't look at color or sticks in some color neutral proxy like zip code, you'll end up just re-inscribing the bigotry. So, for example, there's been a tendency in giving off these problems to artificial intelligence algorithms that give out mortgages or loans as a function of something that's race blind, that racial bias just re-enters because race has become so correlated with other features that the algorithm ends up grouping by race in any case. But the other thing is there are social justice activists who think that race is problematic. It's some because, like Naomi Zak has argued, that many people of mixed race are forced into dichotomous categories, and there's a long history of injustice associated with things like one-drop rules that classify people on the basis of very, very little of their ancestry. Those kinds of views, while I think in certain ways can be construed as aspirationally meaningful and carrying with them the demand to recognize a far greater variation than current classifications would allow, they also can lead to, insofar as race is, for many of us, a grounding in our heritage that's very important for the construction of identity, very important for the formation of lines of political solidarity that are extremely instrumental to fighting for our own recognition and justice, and also bound up with aspects of culture that may be sources of pride, of recreational interest, of lifeways that are fundamental to well-being in human life. So, the idea that somebody can be, say, colorblind or classified as raceless might be an appropriate choice for some, but for many it means that they have to give up on their friends, their peer groups, their cultural institutions, their interests and affections, and that would be a terrible cost.
Yeah. But I wondered, Jesse, whether it's a temporary phenomenon, it's a transition phenomenon. So if you look at the next generation, the generation behind it, will we end up with a Facebook race and a Twitter race, something along those lines, right? So is this sort of a temporary transition phenomenon that we're going through?
I suspect not. Partially because I think we have cases where we've seen tremendous resilience of identity. Consider in the U.S. In the descendants of the settler colonists who conquered this continent.
Yeah.
Many of us who've been here for multiple generations continue to identify as an Italian American or as a Greek American or a Scandinavian American or Jewish American, an African American, an Indian American. All of these identities preserve in the face of enormous pressure to assimilate, preserve in the absence of grounding in language, in inaccessibility to the original communities where many of the customs are, can still practice. People continue to eat certain ways, listen to certain kinds of music, carry out certain pastimes. Even aspects of personality may be shaped by those lines of cultural heritage. So I have every reason to think that these things will continue in the case of race as the internet culture gives us more and more access to shared aspects of humanity as well.
Yeah. So I want to finish up with another topic of interest for you, artificial intelligence. And I'll tell you my bias, Jesse, and then we can debate a little bit. My bias is that artificial intelligence is a wrong term. What we have is automation, expert systems, things that we have had for 50 years from the advent of computers. We use math and statistics. We build models. They can predict. They can cluster. But these are things that we have been doing. We just got faster computers and more memory and stuff like that. So I think it's the wrong term to use for the status quo. And I want to get your perspective on that. If that were true, what's interesting is really to think about what is now called artificial general intelligence. I think that is also a wrong term, but at least we know what we're talking about to some extent, right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I certainly agree. I mean, I do think to the extent that most of the implemented contemporary technologies tend to be trained on a single task, the term intelligence is as something of a euphemism. I don't think there's that much difference between an artificial neural network that's been trained to do just one thing and say an automatic loom for weaving textiles. They're task-specific technologies. That said, the advent of say deep learning neural networks has given us a single technology that can be trained to do very, very different things. And to the extent that we have a technology that's already highly adaptable depending on the training regimen, we've gotten to a degree of generality that is quite unprecedented in the history of technology.
Yeah.
And I do think some of the work in natural language processing platforms like GPT-3 have suggested that you could create, even with contemporary technology, something that could change from at least topic to topic, in this case in a conversational interface, quite fluidly. And artificial general intelligence, to that extent, is in many ways still a future promise, but we have enough of a whisper of it in contemporary technologies to think that this is a real and I think very imminent part of our world.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that with deep learning neural networks and other technologies emerging, we can create things that that can fool a human, data in, data out products that can fool humans, to look and feel like a human. But as you say, it is still not really intelligence, right? It is a tool. It's almost an area of automation in some sense. We're making these tasks really, really automatable. They are generalizable to some extent, but they're not really making. We cannot deploy them in a lab to go find a new drug. I don't know. I mean, we may get there. But we are missing certain aspects, right? Still, and I don't know. I mean, I have, as you know, a lot of neuroscientists on the show, and the general theme I get is that we potentially on a wrong track. The brain doesn't work anything like the artificial neural networks that we currently have.
In a way, yes. I mean, the one big difference is, for understandable reasons, we've tended not to program goals into our AI technologies, or maybe misdescribed as AI technologies. We have goals. We want them to do our bidding, so we give them the task, and we haven't given them the flexibility to decide what they want. And to the extent that some of the most impressive AI technologies involve self-training, we've, I think, resisted that in part because there is a scenario where if we allow a system to decide its own ends and give it the ability to rewire itself to best achieve those ends, we've given these machines a kind of autonomy that makes them ill-suited to the purposes for which they are devised. We want these machines, if you want a machine to do research in your hospital, and you say, okay, well, just come up with your own research platform, we may give it the kind of flexibility that will lead it to make choices other than research. Maybe it'll just want to go and play golf instead. So I think we're keeping these things narrow for a reason, but it doesn't mean we're not technologically in a position to do that. So just as these self-training machines can have the flexibility to come up with very surprising solutions to the problems we give them, if we came up with machines that settled on their own problems, and to that limited extent settled on their own ends, we might discover machines that come up with new research questions, start seeking out solutions to problems that we hadn't posed for them. And that is a fairly foreseeable outcome of where technology is currently going.
Yeah, that's what I think also, Jesse. So I always thought that intelligence is not about solving a known problem. It's about asking questions around unknowns. And if we make machines to make that transition, then one could argue at some point there would be no difference between humans and machines, right?
I mean, in a way, the same issue arises for us. I think we have a tendency to think that innovation is the norm. But in fact, except in interesting but very modest ways, most of us don't innovate. Nobody would think of coming up with a new invention. And we are extraordinarily conformist. I think part of our success is we're great social learners. Innovation is sufficiently infrequent that we're able to spread existing modes in ways that involve an enormous amount of uniformity. We all wear the same kinds of clothes and drive the same kinds of cars and live in the same kinds of homes and eat the same kinds of foods. And were it otherwise, if everyone was a master chef creating a new cuisine, you wouldn't get enough stability for social transmission. You would get a kind of cognitive anarchy.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of human life has a similar feature to what we see in machines, which is a tendency to do what we're told, to put it in somewhat provocative terms.
No, that's exactly right. But the larger philosophical question then would be: are humans worth keeping?
Are humans worth keeping?
Yeah.
Wonderful question. I obviously one view is that we're inevitably going to go away, either because history is long and the planet will die and will destroy it. There are ways in which our life in the history of time is a mere blink of an eye. But there's also this more immediate and impending threat of technology, that we will create technologies that are, for the first time in the history of our species, smarter things sharing the same planet.
Yeah.
And just as we have exerted dominance over all things that were deemed less intelligent than us, there's every reason to think that embodied artificial intelligence that exceeded us in cognitive domains would want to limit our power. Indeed, we would be the biggest threat to such AIs. Short of dumber AIs, we would be in competition and have the ingenuity to try and stop them, and certainly the motivation to try and stop them. So they would sort of necessity want to subdue us. So in that sense, our time is probably limited, especially if we continue with these aspects of technological development. And one answer to that is maybe that's okay. And there's a moral reason for thinking that. And you might say, well, maybe it's okay because we haven't earned our keep. We've been so destructive that as a species, it would be nice to be replaced by beings more intelligent than us. Yeah. But another is to say that it's the nature of humankind to be in constant flux, to be adaptive. And maybe the next stage of the human story is going to be a transhuman story. Maybe the next stage will be one where we merge with technology and start to exist just as we've turned our external realities into digital realities, where we spend hours a day on social media. Maybe we'll turn our internal worlds into digital realities, where we either upload our brains or integrate our biological machinery with external machinery in ways that give us new ways of thinking that begin to look very much like these artificial technologies that we're creating. So an enhanced human mind that shares the benefits of these new development, but originates in some biological material, would no longer be human in the sense that we know it. So we would end up getting rid of ourselves, but in a way that would involve a more agentic, that is a more chosen evolution into a new mode of being, rather than annihilation through competition with these more intelligent beings.
Right. Yeah, my view just is, if you look at it from an external observer, if you sort of draw off the universe's objective function, there is really no, humans don't really bring a lot to the table. As you say, they are boring conformists. We all live, sort of boring lives. And if something, more interesting in the horizon, for an external observer, that would be much more attractive, right?
Well, I myself am worried about a rapid change where we don't really see what's coming and find ourselves in an irreversible situation where things that we've cherished in forms of life that we've come to deeply value are under very serious threat. So, with the techno-pessimists who have been sounding alarm bells, I do think we need to really be proceeding with caution. And, part of that is being a bit more reflective on what kind of lives we want to lead. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with conformity or being boring. I think, the idea that well-being depends on constantly keeping up with the new next.
Yeah.
I'm using a smartphone from 2015 and a laptop that's about as old. So I've never felt the kind of need to walk in lockstep with the latest technology myself, though I am using smartphones and laptops, which I certainly didn't have growing up, and would be very isolated from the world if I didn't choose now.
Yeah.
So it's part of it is really figuring out what we want and finding some balance. I will say, when I reflect on human history, and I think about the enviable moments where I would love to get in that time machine and go back and join that cohort. For me, it's often these times of cultural flourishing. So if you think about, say, various art movements or intellectual movements, the Harlem Renaissance, or you think about the Dada movement in Zurich at the tail end of the First World War, where you have a group of expats from different countries coalescing together and coming up with new and irreverent ways to write poems and make paintings and do politics. To me, those are really exciting, fruitful, playful, rewarding times in our history. And I think it's instructive to remind ourselves that those were not times that avail themselves of the new latest technology. And indeed, in that example, certainly were reactions against it. Dada happened because the First World War showed that automation, for example, in the form of machine guns and airplanes, had creating prospects for destruction that were unprecedented in human history. And they said, we need to press the pause and recover human dignity. And they did that through, the outrages of art. And I would love to see us get to a moment where there was a bit more resistance, where in addition to, those who are pursuing the new next, there are people cultivating forms of life that are independent of all of that. And if we don't keep both these futures in view, I think there's a risk we'll go into the techno future in a way that's unprepared for its downside.
There is one trend that plays into this also, Jesse. I want to get your perspective on it. And that is, there are different predictions around this, but all of our predictions and the timing of those are all wrong. So we can bank on predictions, but it appears that the human population is going to peak at maybe between 9.5 and 10 billion, anywhere from 2060 to 2100. And then we are going to go through a rapid decline of world population. There is only Africa is really growing. Everywhere else, most of the Western countries already have significant negative population growth rates. So the world population is going to peak in a few tens of years, and then start its decline. That also has a lot of implications for machines, right?
I think it does in a way, and you're quite right to say this is unpredicted. We're in a moment that is precarious in exactly the opposite way we thought it would be. In the 1970s, people were still full of kind of Malthusian anxieties that the population explosion would lead to an enormous reduction of resources that made, life conflictual and the world uninhabitable. The opposite has turned out to be true, as far as we can tell at the moment.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think the need to have technology come and fill some of these voids. There are in countries like Japan that have, been very closed to immigration, for instance, that are suddenly in desperate need of workers. And to the extent that technology can fill some of those needs, there may be opportunities for them to continue with more closed borders than they would otherwise have. That may be a bad thing. I'm not commenting on that one way or the other, but it is It is a moment where we're seeing technology as filling a gap. That said, I do think that overall, even with these declines, the rapidity with which we'll see automatic labor is much, much greater than the population reduction can tolerate with the current economic arrangements, which is to say, I think within 20, 30 years, we'll see 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the workforce across many, many sectors being replaced by machines.
Yeah.
And we're not going to see a 20, 30, 40% reduction in the population. As a result, I think it is inevitable that there will be a very, very sharp rise in unemployment. And that's something we need to be thinking very seriously about now. For many, it's an opportunity that we could have machines become the productive force of our economies, and everybody could live in a massive welfare state where the life of leisure is the norm. I think that's a utopian possibility, but one that we could keep in view as an ideal and should be trying to work towards. But the problem is the current economies don't simply allow a transition to that in a fluid way. So people, for instance, have talked quite a lot about universal basic income.
Yeah.
So you can cover people's unemployment that way, but where does that income come from? Well, if it comes from government, and government is deprived of the tax revenue that it would get from the workforce that's now on the streets, their ability to pay for the universal basic income, which will be, in the trillions each year, is going to diminish as the problem increases. And, at that point, I think there's a scenario where the tech companies come in and they say, well, we're producing these technologies, and either through coercion, which is to say taxation, they'll start to cover those costs, or maybe they'll volunteer it and say, we'll take care of the needs of the population, but not for free. I think that's a deal they would make only in return for a greater degree of control over markets and over public policy, to a point where the concept of government that we've come to understand since the emergence of the nation state in the 18th century will start to become more technocratic, will start to involve private sector technology industries playing a greater role in organization at the state scale. And that's just a picture we can't at present fully get our heads around. Until we start thinking seriously about that future, I think we're playing with fire. Whether that future is better than the current system or worse is unclear, but on the face of it, especially as we see growing inequality through these technologies, on the face of it, it looks like it is one that will not guarantee a world that conforms to our current values. And one aspect of that is simply democracy. If you give over political control to a private corporation that's primarily interested in its own profit, it seems like that's going to continue what is the current trend, which is corporate control over governments. Recent studies have shown that if you look at political policy in the American federal legislature, there is enormous correspondence between policy decisions and near zero correspondence between policy decisions and voter interests in the aggregate. Now, magnify that by making corporate America be the actual holder of political power directly rather than through lobbying. And we have an exaggeration, a culmination of the situation that we've been basically designing since the inception of this country. Is that a fulfillment of the American dream or the ultimate indictment? That, I think, is something in future decades, in the near term, we're going to have to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, I view this, Jesse, as sort of a binary outcome. The transition that we're going to go through, as you say, it's inevitable. So either we have to make sort of a cultural change, a societal change. The problem is not that difficult from a mathematical perspective. You're still using your 2015 iPhone. There isn't much of a difference between 2015 and 2021. So this mad rush to get the next toy is part of the current culture. So that culture has to change. A human being needs 2,000 calories to function. There is so much energy available in the world. If you solve the problem mathematically, you can get to very good positions, but it requires a societal and cultural change. So I see pessimistically, Jesse. I see either we going to perish as a level 0 society, or we will transition to a level 1 society. It's going to look really different. The organization structures, the institutions, if they exist, the meaning of work, everything is going to be very, very different. Materialism that sort of envelopes everything today may change. So that will be a level 1 society. But if we don't get there, I don't see good exit points from where we are today.
I, at a certain fundamental level, I agree with that. I do think efforts to sort of shift out of this trajectory completely will fail. There just is no way to do it. People, talk about regulation, and there should be much more regulation than there is. But the idea that you can simply stop these, if you think, for example, about AI technologies that are used in war, powerful governments are going to pursue these regardless of what the policy agreed upon by international bodies says. They have enormous interest in doing so, and we're already seeing the effects. So, we've seen that automated drone weapons can lead to victory in long-standing military conflicts. As those become more and more autonomous, those methods of fighting war that we've sort of developed in the 20th century will adopt to new forms of warfare. And so this kind of inevitability makes us really have to think about more the question of adaptation, as you put it, than the question of avoidance. And it's alarming because human life has already undergone more rapid change in the last century and a half than in all of human history. Basically, from the Neolithic to the Industrial Revolution, there's enormous continuity in how human life is organized.
Right.
And despite great cultural variation in detail, the basic pattern of human life was pretty much unchanged. Then technology emerged that's pretty dramatic in its impact. Now, the growth in that, of course, has been exponential. And if we just think about the advent of technologies, like the train, like the plane, and most recently like the internet, the effects on how we just fill our lives, how we move around in the world, the contact we have, the distribution of resources, all of that is absolutely unanticipated by previous generations, and completely rewrites the human story. Right now, we're in a position where we can play a role in how this story gets written, and we're, I think, looking at various strategies. I myself worry that the merging strategy is one that puts us at the losing end. Once the technologies are developed enough that they have autonomy, that they're making decisions for themselves, if we are to merge, I think what is remaining of our humanity is extremely vulnerable. Will be, if somebody said even to you, Gill, would you merge with your very closest friend? Someone you trust completely and have good grounds to trust, someone you should trust.
No more Italian food in Manhattan.
So, I mean, like when we think about merging, even with friends,
Yeah.
it seems like a suicide. It's a loss. We're no longer the same self. We can't survive such a merge. Um, Now you emerge with someone who is fundamentally of a different kind, and in a certain way, by definition, your enemy, a competitor, with different goals and different interests, and no biographical history of with you, no history of cooperation, collaboration, commitment, no interdependencies with you, no emotional bond of love and affection and respect. There, we're extremely vulnerable to exploitation and destruction. So I tend to think that the merger solution is not going to work. I tend to think that the alignment solution, which says that we should face the advent of increasingly intelligent machines by programming those machines to have moral values that are somehow consistent with ours or aligned with ours, is basically undermined by the mere fact of human moral relativism.
Yeah.
That our values are themselves so varied, and some of our human values are quite awful. So even if you just think about local political divisions, do the technologies conform to Democrat values or Republican values? And I think that's a question for which there is no satisfactory answer. So alignment becomes a problem. And for me, as I review these familiar solutions to the threat, I wonder whether we aren't really in the present moment, unequipped with a satisfactory answer.
Yeah.
My own view is this is maybe a reason why we need philosophers. It's a reason why we need people to be thinking actively about these problems and rather than leaving them over to industry. Because if we don't stop now, if we don't put a pause on now and think very seriously about what 1.0 looks like, what 2.0 looks like, then the question won't be answered by us. It will be answered by these technologies or by the corporate interests that are creating these technologies.
Yeah, I'm somewhat optimistic of a cultural transformation driven by the next generation. I have no data to be optimistic about it, but just from a purely normative perspective, I think that could happen because when I look at my daughter and the people that she interacts with and so on, it is sort of a different human in some sense. So the homocentric views that we hold, our generation holds, may not be valid for the next generation, right? It could be completely rewritten.
I definitely have tremendous hope for and deference to younger generations. I think it's always our place to step aside and let them take the reins. And those of us who are not raised with these technologies, of course, will have naive and limited views about their potential as well. So it is good to vest our hope. And I think there are other ways outside of the technology question in which younger generations have proven to be our moral educators. If you think about certain social justice issues, it's become a commonplace that it's impossible to watch films from the 1980s because they're so cringy in their political incorrectness that to contemporary ears they just sound appalling. And for many who were critics back then, this is just an insight that has been slow on the uptake for the majority, but available to all at the time. But I do think the increasing political engagement of younger generations and a certain kind of open-mindedness. So, if I could put the world in control of any population, it would be like queer youth of color who have, developed whole new modes of being in the world, new forms of expression, new political lines of alliance, new global communities. They have, broken from a very restricted canon that's tended to, in terms of education, that's tended to, be navel gazing and repeat old biases and old patterns of knowing and expand that out in ways that's much more exciting and inclusive. Even in my own field, the range of topics that people are taking on now vastly outstrips the range that was available when I was going through my graduate study. So I do see in younger people a kind of explosion, partially fueled by this technology, of interest in variations of all kinds. And for me, that is the most exciting development of the modern moment. And if I ask myself what I want of technology, I think that the answers I would give would be limited by an imagination that is reared on, whatever 80s movies or 80s technology in ways that makes me less equipped to come up with ideas than people who are a decade or two or three younger. So maybe the people who are just coming into school age now are going to come up with the solutions that we'll all need. And even if they're not the solutions that we old folks would want, they're going to come up with solutions that suit their values and their ways of being in the world. And I think that's how it should be.
Yeah, let's hope that happens, Jesse. There are a group of folks working on making Mars great again as the secondary option.
Absolutely.
Excellent. This has been great, Jesse. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
What a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gill, and thanks for the series.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.